Hi everyone, I'm Riccardo, the host of this podcast, and today the topic is training and nutrition, what actually works, with Dr. Eric Helms.
What's up, Riccardo?
I can't complain.
I'm glad to hear it. Good not to have to complain. We could complain, but we choose not to.
Yeah, it's a choice. It's a choice, totally. So, I would like to start with a little introduction about you, but focused specifically on your gym background. I mean, how did your journey with the gym begin? Because a lot of people know you as a prominent figure in the lifting and fitness community, but I think that this can be something very interesting for people.
Sure, yeah. So my personal journey with the iron started in 2004. People often talk about when they first started lifting and you wonder, well, what kind of athletic background did you have before that? I did very little weightlifting in any kind of structured or consistent way prior to 2004. By the way, 2004, I was 21. So I started lifting in my early 20s. I did martial arts growing up, and I did run track and field. I ran the 400 meters in high school. And I did take a weights class in my last year of high school for one semester. But I didn't enjoy weightlifting, and I wasn't really trying. I would do what was asked of me by my track coach. Okay, I'll do some power cleans. But I didn't train on my own consistently. I had friends in the I was in the military for 4 years, so I did a lot of push-ups and running. Yeah, one enlistment. So from 18 till the age of 21. And I started lifting weights in my last year in the Air Force. So yeah, I got attracted to the iron because I was dealing with some personal stress in my life at that time. And it was a outlet, and it was a healthy outlet, because the other options of the ways I was trying to cope as a young man were not healthy, and I was fortunately self-aware enough to realize that. So I sought out a friend of mine who was a recreational bodybuilder who was also in the Air Force, and he kind of showed me the ropes and had me doing workouts from literally Arnold's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding to start. And being the type of curious person I am, this quickly led to me wanting to follow a more scientific approach. And, here we are, I'm a senior research fellow and working in this area and doing research myself. But all the way back in 2004, I was just really, really interested in just getting as big and strong as possible. And from the outset, I would say I had concurrent strength and size goals. So I was kind of what some would call a power builder from the start. So yeah, I started training in 2004. The approach we took was high volume and to failure, training on, I wouldn't call it a full bro split. I probably have always had at least a frequency of training each muscle group about twice per week, even if it was indirectly initially. I was probably starting with 15 to 20 sets per muscle group, if you think about it. Like, we would have our, quote unquote, chest and triceps day, but we would do 3 sets on every single exercise in the gym. So it would be flat, incline, decline, and flies or crossovers. So it was probably 12 sets, and then I'd get some indirect work, 4 or 5 days later. So, and every set to failure, and then forced reps. So that was just kind of the way we did it. Trying to lift heavy, trying to go up and load. I was doing deadlifts, bench, and squat from the start. So those are always part of my training from the beginning. And
but I don't know how did works this in US, because, for example, in Italy, we discover, about the main public, powerlifting only probably around 10 years ago. Because before we had some powerlifters, clearly, but was a real niche. Now in the last 10 years, it's very exploded. And for this reason, you can talk with people in the gym, they know what is powerlifting. But 10 years ago, nope. Deadlift, squat, bench press are exercises from the gym, clearly, but not with that specific, technique, or maybe, the stop at the chest with the bench, all these nuances, if you think about that. But in US was different.
Absolutely.
You
Yeah.
already knew.
Yeah, I mean, it's not mainstream. It's more mainstream now than it ever has been, which is great. But there were definitely powerlifting gyms, bodybuilding gyms, and
Wow.
like if you were in the lifting culture, that was something you would know about. Like you have figures like Ed Cohn, the West Side
Yeah, I
Barbell.
remember him.
Yeah, so it's been
A mix,
uh,
a power builder, we can say that, because he was also so aesthetic.
Yeah, and power building it's a modern term that I'm not a huge fan of because it doesn't really acknowledge that historically there was much more merging between training for strength and hypertrophy from the very start.
Yeah,
You can
I
find
totally agree. I totally agree with this because we well know the origin of powerlifting. I mean, not the powerlifting, of the bodybuilding, I mean, with Eugene Sando. That basically, I think that we can say that he was a power builder. I mean, he was a bodybuilder. But this concept, nowadays, if you think it's power building, was a bodybuilder.
yeah. The idea that it's really hard to train for both at the same time is kind of historically ignorant. So, powerlifting became an organized sport in the 60s, and that basically started kind of concurrently in the English speaking world in the US and the UK. And there were these debates over what should be powerlifting, because it started with the odd lifts. And the odd lifts were lifts that weightlifters used as supplementary exercises. So as in the 60s, the two sports kind of split, and weightlifting was its own thing. Until the early 70s, it was snatch, clean, and jerk, and also clean and press. And then in the UK, it was squat, deadlift, and strict curl in the initial stages. And in the US, it was
Nice.
squat, deadlift, and bench press. And you can still find some strict curl competitions, but by the end of the 60s, early 70s, the universal powerlifting kind of formed to where it is squat, bench, deadlift. And then from like basically what we consider like kind of the golden era, the Arnold era, the 60s, 70s, and 80s onward, that was kind of when the two started to split. But you can find old pictures of Franco Columbu and Arnold Schwarzenegger competing together in powerlifting meets in the early 60s as an example. So there was always this, powerlifters and bodybuilders trained together for a long time, and that only changed, I would say, into the like 80s and 90s. They started to have specific powerlifting gyms and specific bodybuilding gyms as you started to develop the powerlifting system where they have like a world championships and everything. But anyway, I would say the US, it was always a niche thing, both bodybuilding and powerlifting, at least competitive bodybuilding and powerlifting.
Yeah.
But certainly training for strength and being influenced by powerlifting was pretty normal. Like if you said I'm training for strength, people would assume you're going to do squat, bench, and deadlift, and then you would use some powerlifting techniques. So from the beginning, I would say I was heavily influenced by powerlifting practice and bodybuilding practice.
Yeah, nice. You see, different. In Italy, usually we tend to say that we discover all things later on compared to US. I think that is normal. And were there were there any phases or experiences as natural athlete that deeply shaped your current philosophy around training and coaching?
Yeah, I think to continue on in that vein, I remember the first job where I got hired as a I was an instructor in a degree-based program, like a one-year associate's degree program is what we call it in the United States. They want to know what that is, they can listen to our other podcasts where we talked about the differences in degrees in different places. But it's like a 1 year to year and a half program where you learn to be a personal trainer. So it's like not just a weekend course. I got hired to be an instructor for that course in 2010. And the part of the hiring process was to do a test teach. So you'd give a lecture just to demonstrate your ability to teach, and it was on concurrent hypertrophy and strength training. and I talked about how obviously my thoughts have evolved a lot from then, but I talked about how it's really not that challenging, and you can effectively train for both at the same time. And here's how I'd recommend doing it, and that's how I trained. So I like to include sets of like 3 to 5 on squat, bench, and deadlift, and I think that did heavily influence me. A big thing with bodybuilding in the mid 2000s, even into the 20 teens, was there was not as much awareness of the concept of progressive overload. So training hard, training to failure, and like accidentally inducing progressive overload was certainly there, but there was a lot of focus on kind of the pump, the squeeze, and the sensations related to it. And it was like kind of the rare people promoting having a logbook and trying to beat it. Good shout out to Dante Trudell and DC training. That was one of the few systems, and maybe like Max OT. There was a few kind of high intensity, lower volume approaches that were like the progenitors of those systems were promoting it. And then probably the more contemporary example would be Lane Norton's power hypertrophy adaptive training, or FAT training, which he started promoting in like the late 2000s, 2010. And I had already been training that way for like 5 years. So when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's cool. Because I was, Lane Norton was probably one of the first kind of like evidence-based bodybuilding influences on me.
Totally.
And actually was my coach for my second season for the majority of my 2009 competitive season. So I did my first powerlifting meet is an unsanctioned, so it wasn't related to any organization, and push-pull meet, so bench press deadlift only, at the YMCA where I first did it. So I had my first personal training job.
In the same meeting?
Yeah, so it's basically a normal powerlifting meet, but no squat. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and that's they have a few organizations like that. There's a organization, I don't know if it's that big anymore in the States, called WABDL, WABDL, and it's the World Association of Benchers and Deadlifters. So push-pull meets are a thing in the States in some places. It's starting to come out of favor, though. Yeah, now that the IPF is more prominent and that raw lifting is more prominent, there's a lot more organization and kind of structure around powerlifting. It used to be that there's just a whole bunch of small organizations, and the IPF was still the main one, but because they primarily had single ply equipped competition until 2012, they never got that big. A big thing that held powerlifting back, and probably the reason why it didn't really blow up in Italy until a decade ago, was that until 2012, the biggest powerlifting organization, the IPF and all its international affiliates, didn't have unequipped lifting. So raw lifting was spread across a lot of the other mixture of tested and untested organizations. There's a billion different feds. And then when the IPF decided, maybe we should do this whole raw thing, and they had the first raw classic worlds in 2012, it blew up. Because now all of a sudden you don't have to spend $600 to get a bench shirt, squat suit, and the barrier to entry.
But also a big problem that I think about, because I tried once the keep the bench. Was terrible, because the feeling, the pain of that specific t-shirt. But what I remember was, for example, that you can train alone. For example, for the bench, you need other people, and it's not always possible.
And it takes forever.
Exactly.
That was the way that powerlifting gyms were in the pre-raw era. Is you'd have specific days where everyone would come in at the same time, partially for that reason. It also had some really cool camaraderie aspects, but you would know that, say, like Tuesday, Thursday are the days we bench, and Monday, Friday are the days or Monday, Wednesday are the days we squat, and then Saturday we deadlift or something like that. Everyone get together because you need help getting in and out of the suits. Yeah.
Exactly. So if you think that maybe one person can have his duties, something that they can train with you can not train.
No, yeah. This is also some of the reason why the powerlifting training methods were much more homogenous. They had a lot less variability in that era, because certain things were just not possible. You couldn't do a high volume, high frequency of equipped lifting specifically. You have to train out of equipment and in equipment. So the differences between systems more had to do with when did you train in equipment, when did you train out, and like, just to give people perspective if they're not familiar with it, a bench only session, if you're doing it with a bench shirt on for all your sets, can take 2 hours to get through what would take you 30 minutes to do a raw bench session. So it's things have changed a lot in powerlifting, and right around the 20 teens is when it started to blow up, and it's still getting even bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger right now because of the popularity of it. And I mean, if you think about how many people bench, squat, and deadlift, it's such an accessible sport. So it has a level of participation and interest that was always held back by the fact that it was primarily equipped. So now that that's changed, it's not a big surprise to me that Italy was, started about a decade ago, because that's once the raw lifting really took off internationally. So anyway, nonetheless, I remember my early competitions as a powerlifter. I was competing without equipment in meets where they sometimes did not have a raw division. I was just competing against people who were wearing bench shirts and squat suits. But sometimes we would try to target the meets that were rare. Like we have to go online, try to find these meets, and then go, oh, do they have a raw division? No. But it's the only one, in my area in the next 3 months. So
yeah,
that's okay. I'll just compete without a bench shirt and squat suit and try to get a PR. But then 2009, 2010, 2011, and then boom, 2012, when the IPF enters the scene, raw lifting became more and more popular. And you may recall, this is more of an American thing, but right around 2013, 14, 15, before the IPF had really taken off with raw lifting, like there were some meets like Raw Unity, where they'd have all the different feds come together to compete. There was some, the era of like Dan Green, and some of these other pretty popular personalities. Like Untested Raw Lifting kind of blew up first, and it kind of hit its limit because it still had multiple feds. Like they had these big personalities, but then once you had big personalities, a unified fed, and the IPF promoting raw lifting, by 2016, 2017, I would say, it became dominant, and now it's no question. It's where raw powerlifting is at. And I started to see that. I moved to New Zealand in 2012, and I did my first powerlifting meet here in my first IPF affiliate in 2013. So I've been competing as a powerlifter with the NZPF from 2013 until I think my last meet was in 2023. Not my last forever, but I've been focusing on bodybuilding. So anyway, people might think of me more as a bodybuilder, but it's probably just because I'm better at bodybuilding. But my very first competitive endeavor as a lifter was that push-pull meet in 2006 that I did at the YMCA, where I was a personal trainer. And then I started doing sanctioned meets in the local area in California where I lived from 2007 till 2011. I did probably 8 or 9 meets, and I would do those between bodybuilding seasons or even in the lead up to them. I recorded one meet at, I think I was under 83 kilos because I was in almost stage shape, but most of my meets I did at 100 or under 90. So, yeah.
But it's my curiosity, but since I know my public, my followers, just to know some numbers, your PR, your best in bench deadlift.
Yeah. So my best in competition numbers are slightly lower than my best because of COVID. So the best squat I've ever done was 227.5. And that was done at a body weight of 93. That was actually, I had my tickets. I was ready to go to New Zealand Nationals in 2021, and I was peaked and ready to compete. And then we had a lockdown for COVID in Auckland. They had the first day of nationals that still happened. So if you look for New Zealand Nationals in 2021, you can see the Masters results, but nobody else.
No.
So yeah, so what I did instead was I competed on the same day at the same time, weighed in my garage, and I saw what I could do. So my best bench and squat were done on the day of nationals when it should have been, and that was a 227.5 and 155 competition style bench. And that day I had like a 247 deadlift, but my best deadlift ever in competition is 260, and I pull sumo. And those were all done in the 93 kilo class. So in competition officially, if you look me up in powerlifting like open powerlifting, you'll see 222 and a half, and I think a 150 or 152 bench. But if I was like, ideally in the 93 kilo class, if I was to get back on the platform, I would want to see 227, 155, 260 or higher if I was to be training to improve. So I'm right around like a mid 600s total at 93, and I have competed at 83, and I'm closer to like a high 500s, low 600s, but I haven't really tried to fully peak at 83 because that's very lean for me. My stage weight's about 80. So
yeah, in fact, I was thinking that you mentioned this all these performances, but the thing is that I was also thinking, okay, but you are, if I remember correctly, 1.85 tall. Oh, yeah, I think that your proper category for powerlifting maybe is 105, maybe more. I mean,
if well, here's the thing. It's like the assumption of what one's proper weight class should be in powerlifting is based upon observations of people who are good at powerlifting, who are well built for powerlifting, I should say.
yeah, you're
So
right.
for example, yeah, like the typical person who is 183.5 tall, like I am, is, if they're really, really good, is a 105 or a 120, typically. Sometimes a super, if they have the bone structure for that. But the question should be, on that note, why aren't the supers always taller than the 120s? And the answer is this, is that it's not just your height that dictates your weight, it is your bone structure. And I have a relatively small frame, if you look at if you just look at my joint size. So I have actually never been able to get up to 105. The heaviest I've ever been is 102. And that's like intentionally trying to, actually 102 I hit after my first bodybuilding season. So that was like with like post-competition binging, But the heaviest I've ever been able to intentionally gain weight up to in recent years is 98. In 2010, in my off season after 2009, I was able to get up to 100. But again, some of that is driven by I was, basically using too restrictive of approach during my bodybuilding season. It was really easy to gain weight. But in 2016, I was trying to get up to 105 and I couldn't. I got up to 98 and I just like the amount of food I was having to eat and the amount of I was not hungry at all. And, I got up to 98 and then I cut down to 93 and competed in 2016. So if you look at me, when you see me at 100 or around that body weight, you can tell like I'm at the same body composition as someone who would be at like a 105 or not necessarily a 120 unless I was a little taller. I just don't have that frame to carry that much body mass. So
No.
yeah,
I understand because it's very similar with my situation. I'm small because I'm 10 centimeters shorter, but with my body weight is the same because I competed too, and I competed in. My body weight in competition about powerlifting was roughly between minus 74, minus 83, but always maybe my body weight was 75, but I am also 176. So you see, I understand totally. But
yeah. For reference, like I coached Bryce Lewis from first meet till his retirement. He's his best ever total in competition is 922, and his best training total is 937. He won the 2018 World Championship, so he's still like in one of the top 25 lifters ever in the 105 kilo class, and who are drug free. He's 5'6", so he's shorter than you. And he was cutting weight to make 105. Not a lot, but he would walk around at 106, 107,
Yeah.
So that is the type of frame that does well in powerlifting. And, these days it's gotten even more competitive. Someone like Bryce would probably need to cut to 93 and to be competitive and be totaling, 900. So it's like the elite level of powerlifting. You can look at my body and you go, he's not built for that. Like it's just like
Me too.
it's unless you've been exposed to elite level sport, you don't understand how much of a gap there is between being like good at the sport, like the 80th percentile, for example, versus being at the elite level. So if we take the top 93s right now, they're totaling like over 900. Like a 900 kilo total is the elite of the elite tip of the spear. But the 80th percentile in the open class, you're better than 79% of powerlifters. Is like a 700 total, maybe slightly less. And we have stats on that. So I think people sometimes forget that there's levels to this. Like, that's being strong, not just generally, it's being strong for a powerlifter. So if you're 93 and you can total 500, you're strong. You're stronger than 99% of the general population. If you total 600, you're like average for a powerlifter, a strength athlete. And if you're totaling 700, you meet 10 powerlifters, 8 of them you're stronger than. But that's not what gets you a world championship when you got, tens of thousands of people competing. So anyway, I have done over 20, I've done 20 powerlifting meets in my career.
Mm-hmm.
And I've also dabbled in weightlifting. So like I mentioned, my first bodybuilding season was 2007. My second one was 2009. My third one was 2011. Then 2012, I moved to New Zealand to start to pursue my second master's and my PhD. And I said, you know what, I'm not going to do bodybuilding until I'm done with my PhD.
Yep.
But I did keep competing in strength sport. And one of the things that I wanted to do to become a better student of strength and conditioning was I wanted to try weightlifting. So I trained in weightlifting concurrently with powerlifting from 2012 all the way through 2015-16. And I've done 5 weightlifting meets in total, and I came back to weightlifting in 2020. I gave it another good year and a half to compete as a master's, because they 35 and over is masters for weightlifting, not 40 and over like it is for powerlifting.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, because you get slow. Like, if you look at the peak performances in weightlifters, that happens about 6, 7, 8 years earlier than powerlifters, because it's not just about force production, it's also about velocity and mobility. You have to be able to get very deep.
Yeah.
It's rare that you see someone in their 30s who's at the top of the game in weightlifting. It still happens. Like Liu Xiaojin still won an Olympic medal, I think, at 31 or 32. But you will see powerlifters competing in the open category and winning medals in their early 40s. You won't see that in weightlifting. You'll see it in their early 30s at the latest. So it's about a 10-year gap between where you can hope to peak. So anyway, I have done weightlifting. I'm a better bodybuilder than a powerlifter, but I am a better powerlifter than I'm a weightlifter. So I'm not good enough there. I'm not very strong or mobile overhead. So I also did try strongman. I've done 2, not full meets, but strongman events. I did a log press, strongman deadlift competition. And I also did a pretty cool event in Auckland where it was a train pull. So they had this train caboose, and you do a vehicle pull and Atlas stones, max Atlas stone. So I trained for those. I did those in 2019. I did 2 strongman competitions, and I've also done 1 Highland Games competition. So I've done 17 physique competitions, and I'm much better at looking like I lift than lifting heavy things. And I'm not very strong overhead. So the only strength sport that I'm even decent at is powerlifting. But then there's levels to that, But in bodybuilding, I'm actually pretty decent in terms of my competitiveness.
I mean, now you're a pro bodybuilder.
It took me a long time, but I did get there, yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, talking after this very interesting introduction about your expertise, I would like to walk in the training section of this podcast with a very, very famous question, maybe, about volume or intensity. Which one truly drives long-term gains?
Yeah, I think the term, people get people talk across each other when speaking about volume and intensity because for 2 reasons. One is the term driver, which you will hear, or stimulus, or mechanism, or the causal factor. And then the other thing they get a little confused about is intensity, which means different things if you talk to different people. And even volume can mean different things when you talk to different people. Like if you talk to someone about doing high volume, sometimes they think high rep sets, or they think about volume load. So I think the first thing we have to do is kind of define our terms, right? So
Standardized, yeah.
Exactly. Or it's just difficult to have a conversation, right? So if we're going to talk about volume, probably the most universal way of discussing it is the number of sets that you perform either per session or per week for a given muscle group. And even how you count volume depends. Like, so I would say it's sets per muscle group per week. We'll talk about it in that manner because that's the easiest thing to do. I like to use what's called like the fractional counting method, which seems to best describe the data when you look at research. It's not a perfect fit. You know, it's a model. It doesn't describe reality. Where the secondary muscle group trained by a set, say like your triceps and a bench press, you would count a bench press as half a set for it, and you count it as one set for the pecs. What you count as secondary or primary, there's a little bit of ambiguity there for sure, but it depends upon on the given exercise. So if we're talking about a fractional counting method of sets per muscle group, we have some pretty clear data now indicating that volume does have a pretty solid influence on influencing hypertrophy. But is it the main driver? Like, what is actually causing hypertrophy? So at that, we have to kind of peel all the way back to what is the actual mechanism? What's happening when you make muscle grow from weight training specifically? And that's a process called mechanotransduction. And that is simply that within the smallest unit of contractile tissue, the sarcomere, which is within the myofiber, that's actually where actin and myosin bind and contract and sliding filament theory occurs. There are several different things that we call mechanosensors. And these are typically protein structures, but not exclusively. The actual nuclei in muscle fibers, they flatten when a muscle fiber is stretched and contracts, and there's even thought that that might actually create the signaling cascade of mechanotransduction, which induces hypertrophy. But most of the mechanosensors we're aware of are protein structures, like you probably heard of titin, which is described as a molecular spring. It's the largest protein molecule that we have in muscle, and that's why it's called titin big. It's TITIN, and it actually anchors the contractile proteins to the cytoskeleton. So it's connecting the contractile proteins to the sarcomere so that they can anchor and create contraction, and it gets stretched during the eccentric. It kind of unwinds, and that also seems to be part of the signaling process. But that is not the only one. There is also what's called costomeres, which are sometimes called focal adhesions, if you read older papers. And these enable the muscle to propagate force laterally, so that if one fiber contracts, it's going to effectively create a good force transmission to neighboring fibers as well through these focal adhesions, these costamere lateral transmission. So not only does it distribute force, but it also senses force and seems to be part of that signaling cascade. And there's also, in the membrane of the actual muscle fiber cell, there are other mechanosensors that have to do with calcium ion gates and a lot of cool molecular stuff. But there's like 5 or more, and I'm sure there's more we're going to discover, mechanosensors in muscle. Yeah. And they respond to some type of actual mechanical force, and mechanotransduction means that they're translating that into a chemical signal. So there's autocrine and paracrine, which just describes hormone or hormone-mediated like effects, things like IGF-1, MGF, and other signaling cascades that end up stimulating, and the mTOR complex, which you might have heard of, which is what turns on muscle protein synthesis, and muscle protein synthesis is what builds muscle. So why did I go into all that depth? That none of that matters, but essentially what we need to understand is that the actual act of creating a tension stimulus, mechanical tension, that's what we mean, at the smallest level, is what initiates the actual process of signaling for hypertrophy. And then if you supply all the amino acids necessary, the essential amino acids, and especially leucine, and you have enough energy in your body, ATP, to fuel that process, and you have the right environment for recovery long term so that you can have that result in a net positive balance of muscle protein synthesis, you'll build muscle. So the thing that actually drives hypertrophy, the actual mechanism, you could argue is quote unquote intensity or tension. And when we talk about intensity as a resistance training variable, it's typically describing two things which can impact mechanical tension. Either the load, either the relative or the absolute load, so percentage 1RM, or just the absolute amount of load on the bar, or the stack, or the dumbbell, or your body weight, or whatever the hell you're resisting. Or it describes your proximity to failure, or the amount of effort that you're putting into the bar. So your intention to accelerate the load, and then how close to the point of momentary failure, which means where you cannot perform another concentric rep, are you getting. Now, where people often get it twisted, and if we kind of go all the way back to 2010, like where Schoenfeld published his 3 mechanisms of hypertrophy: muscle damage, metabolic stress, and mechanical tension.
The Bible.
That's right. That's evolved. That's a 15-year-old hypothesis, and Schoenfeld himself has updated it. And I think people get a little hung up on that, and they misinterpret it. Mechanical tension doesn't mean lifting heavy.
Me too, if you remember.
I do.
We have a discussion by email about that before coming here, because honestly, I had the same idea that load was equal to mechanical tension.
That's right. And some of the early hypotheses were based upon that. Like you will even see out of now Dr. Schoenfeld's original doctoral thesis or dissertation, because it was in the States, he described, well, does heavy lifting, which optimizes mechanical tension, or does higher rep lifting with shorter rest periods, which optimizes metabolic stress, because it emphasizes fatigue, can those both produce hypertrophy? And that is a somewhat incomplete understanding of mechanical transduction. If we go even further back to something called Henneman's size principle. So Henneman is the name of the researcher who studied and helped us understand motor unit behavior. A motor unit is simply the nerve and the muscle fibers it innervates. And people have probably heard that we have type 1 and type 2 fibers. A better way of understanding that is that we have a spectrum of fibers that are that range from being harder to fatigue and being more oxidative to being more glycolytic, excuse me. A little bit of mispronunciation there. They contract faster and they're easier to fatigue. So they're more powerful and less fatigue resistant. That's your quote unquote type 2 fibers, but there's a spectrum of those. Motor units typically also innervate. Yep.
If I can add one thing, because I noticed that a lot of people tend to oversimplify this concept, because it's true that generally we have 3 different main kind of these fibers, but usually in a human being you will find a mix of these fibers.
Yes.
It's difficult to find specifically one type.
Exactly. And there's different ways, if you look through the research with muscle fibers, of how they've been categorized over time. There are different staining techniques. And now you can actually look at the myosin heavy chain content to get an idea of the type of capacity a fiber has. And there's intermediary fibers. And the fiber transitions, at least in the moderate to short term, seem to happen within the category of slow and fast, type 1, type 2. That's kind of like the chassis. But you can have a type 2 fiber that becomes as oxidative as possible to mimic a type 1 fiber, or it can become as fast twitch as possible to be similar to that type 2X isoform that is more powerful, depending upon the type of training you're exposed to and also the lack of training. So an interesting thing is that if you start training at all, you will see fewer type 2X, which are the most explosive fibers, and that's because any training is more oxidative than none. Sedentary people, they're adapting to being sedentary, and their fibers are not being worked. So when you have a high proportion of quote-unquote type 2X fibers, you think of that as being super powerful and great for being a power athlete. But what that really reflects is that there's been no metabolic challenge to those fibers. So you have a huge proportion of fibers that don't need to be fatigue resistant, and they're not very good at handling different substrates because you don't do anything with them. So you're not a great strength athlete because you have no muscle mass, right? You have a small size of a whole bunch of type 2X fibers. So the main thing that actually indicates your force production and your power production is the total amount of fiber tissue you have, contractile tissue. So when someone first starts weight training, even if it's like pure weight training and shot puts and jumping, you're going to see a transition from type 2X to type 2A, and then the various isoforms from that. Now, in the long term, though, if you actually look at like twins over time have trained in different ways, or if you look at like most modern techniques in people over really long periods and case studies, the evidence would indicate that there is actually conversion between type 2 and type 1 and back and forth. It just takes longer, and the total proportion of change is not huge. But we're still understanding this. So anyway, all that is to say, different fibers produce more or less force, and we have what's called high threshold motor units, which are the ones that are only going to recruit those really easy to fatigue but very powerful fibers, those type 2X fibers, right? And our body is very conservative. We're a survival machine. So as I'm talking here and moving my hands, for those who are watching on YouTube, I'm not recruiting my high threshold motor units, which can produce the most force and the most power. I am recruiting mostly slow twitch fibers. And it is only when I train to fatigue or I try to generate a high degree of force all at once, or power, that I will need to recruit some of these high threshold motor units. So if I was to put, let's say, 60 kilos on my back and try to jump as high as I possibly could, you would see a short, quick recruitment of all of the muscles, all the motor units involved with doing a squat. And of course, they would only be on for a second because I would generate enough force to leave the ground. Now, if you put 160 kilos on my back and I squatted, you would see the same fibers get recruited because it's heavy enough. That's probably right now, 80% of my 1RM because I'm not training for powerlifting. And everything would need to be turned on for me to meet the force demands, but they would stay turned on for the most of that concentric until I got past the sticking region for much longer. So I could lift, and that's why plyometrics aren't great for building muscle. They'll build muscle in beginners, but because they only have these short amplitudes, you're not getting enough time under tension, and also the contractile speed is quite quickly, so you're nowhere near fatigue, right? So I could lift heavy, and I could put 160 kilos on my back and do 3 sets of 5, and that would what we would think traditionally would be a mechanical tension set. But in reality, if I put 100 kilos on my back, and instead of doing 3 sets of 5, I did 3 sets of 12, and I got near failure. And if you looked at the speed of my last rep on my set of 12 and my set of 5, they'd probably be quite similar. And the only reason why that 12th rep is moving slow is because of fatigue. My first rep with that set of 12 with 100 kilos would be actually quite fast. And then maybe by my 6th or 7th rep, you'd start to see a very slight slowing. And by my 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th rep, it would be getting slow, really slow, approaching the same speeds as my 3rd, 4th, and 5th rep with 160 kilos. Now, what is happening there, if we talk about Henneman's size principle, is in those earlier reps, in that 12 rep set, I'm only recruiting maybe 2/3, 3/4 of the motor unit pool. And then eventually, as fatigue is occurring, I will need to recruit the high threshold motor units to complete that set and meet the force demands of 100 kilos until I can no longer meet those force demands because of fatigue. And Henneman's size principle simply states that you recruit motor units in order of the needs of the force demands of the movement, and that it's either completely on or off, and that's it. It's the all or nothing principle, and Henneman's size principle help you understand, like, okay, if I need this number of motor units to lift 40% of 1RM, that's all that's going to be on. They're going to be on completely, and that's it. But that's only one contraction. If I keep doing contractions with 40% of 1RM, what we see is a phenomenon that is called motor unit cycling or motor unit substitution, where to continue to meet the force demands and overcome fatigue, the body will actually purposely turn off certain motor units to give them an opportunity to recover, and then they will cycle them back in or substitute them in. And it'll keep doing that to meet the specific demands of a 40% of 1RM set until it runs out because everything is too fatigued and you're demanding more ATP at a rate that then you can produce. So what happens is let's say you're doing like a tempo set. You're deciding you want to do a 2-second concentric with 60% of 1RM as an example. You will be able to do that no problem for, say, the first 8 reps, but eventually you are going to involuntarily be doing 2-second reps because you're producing less force and you're not holding yourself back. And eventually you'll hit failure because you won't be able to do a concentric in 2 seconds. It might take 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 seconds, and then you'll be unable to complete the task. But the important thing is at the sarcomere level, going all the way back to like, why the hell did you tell us about mechanosensors, Eric, is that you end up stimulating those mechanosensors in every single one of those muscle fibers innervated by all of those different motor units, regardless of whether you do a set of 5 or whether you do a set of 20, if it's reasonably close to failure, so long as you get that involuntary slowing, whether it's because it's heavy or whether it's because you did enough reps to where motor unit cycling and substitution resulted in fatigue generated mechanical tension. So you will get the same mechanical tension from a set of 20 to failure or a heavy set of 5. And that is the disconnect that we've had. Intensity, as it relates to hypertrophy, is probably best described as an appropriate rep range and then appropriate proximity to failure. And they interact. When you're training with loads that I would say are 10 RM or heavier, the proximity to failure is much less important. You could train probably at a 2 or 3 RIR, so long as the set has enough reps in it to actually stimulate growth. And where that lower bound threshold is probably somewhere between like 4 to 6 reps. That's when a set, quote unquote, counts, so long as it's reasonably heavy. So if you're lifting like 10 RM loads or higher, so 75, 80% of 1 RM or heavier, and you're getting at least 4 or 5 reps, RIR probably doesn't matter. Repetitions in reserve, how close you are to failure. But if you're doing 10 to, say, 40 reps, which are all valid ways of training to failure, I wouldn't do it on certain exercises. Or training for hypertrophy, I wouldn't do it for all exercises. That's where RIR becomes important. And we see that the closer you train to failure, in isolation, in a vacuum, for that set, the more stimulus it'll provide. And we have big picture meta-analytic data on that. So the thing that actually drives hypertrophy or actually causes hypertrophy is technically intensity. It is getting enough motor unit recruitment and training them, which you can do by training heavy or training near to failure with a light to moderate load. But then the question is, well, how much of that do I need to do to grow? And that's volume. And I think the best way to view this is that volume is like the dose of a drug, but intensity is the drug itself. So when people tell me, is it volume or intensity, that's like asking, well, hold on, do I need to take 3 Xanax or just is it important that I take Xanax? And I'm like, well, that's a nonsense question. What is the dose you need of Xanax to get the outcome you want for why you're taking it? Like, ask your doctor. And some people, depending upon the severity of their symptoms and how much tolerance they've built up to that medication, are going to need to take a higher dose of Xanax than other people to get the same outcome. And the same is true of volume. There seems to be a relatively consistent relationship where more volume is beneficial until it's not, because it will sap your recovery resources or create issues in terms of muscle damage or things like that. But the actual stimulus is, does that set actually recruit enough motor units and train them? And the answer, therefore, is you need to do an appropriate amount of volume, but you need to first make sure that the intensity is there.
Yeah. No, clear. Yeah, you see, it's a dichotomous, I don't know, because people tend always to separate the things about training, not only about training, but they tend to see things that are totally like muscle fibers, totally separated, but it's obviously it's a mix. It's something that you cannot distinguish, you cannot separate. So I hope that with this answer, people will start to understand also the meaning of this question, at least.
Absolutely.
And another thing that I would like to ask you that I I heard a lot in the field is about the natural limit. Because I think, it's in my opinion, that is one of the biggest lie in natural training, this idea of the natural limit. And what I want to ask you is that since you've continued to progress even as a master athlete now, talking about bodybuilding, what's the key to sustainable gains beyond what's often considered the ceiling?
Yeah, I think the first thing to understand is the nature of how we grow. And a big shout out to James Steele, who's done a lot of work in this area lately, who's done the modeling to describe what happens with your growth. And there is roughly unfortunately, there's a logarithmic relationship to how muscle growth goes, and a logarithmic plateauing relationship. This is true of strength and muscle growth, and it's been observed in pretty large data sets. That essentially, if you take a given amount of time, the amount of growth that someone makes when we observe training studies that last a long enough time period, or the amount of muscle or strength they gain in that time period, you'll have to like double that same amount of time to make the same amount of gains. So, for example, let's say you went from a 300-pound squat to a 400-pound squat in a year. It would probably take you 2 years to get from a 400-pound squat to a 500-pound squat, and then 4 years, and then 8 years, and then 16 years, and now you run into the point where maybe age-related declines, depending upon when you started training, in various physiological systems, not just testosterone, because we see similar patterns in women, are now making it harder. Or you've accumulated too many injuries, or most of the time, you're just not as motivated or interested, or your life goals have changed. So the most important thing that you need to do to be committed to continue to make progress is to understand that relationship, accept it, and then understand that if you want to get to your closest to your peak potential that you can, you have to be interested in making gains until you hit like 60, and you have to progressively and purposely continue to monitor your training and try to get better, and understand that the more gains you make, the harder it'll be to make the next level of gains. There's a really cool modeling study that was based upon the Open Powerlifting database, where they looked at how much of an increase on someone's total would they get in their first year of powerlifting, to show you how this logarithmic relationship comes out. And on average, and there's a huge amount of variability, so individuals vary. Remember, this is describing like 15,000 lifters, not Tom or Jane, who you might know. There are always going to be exceptions, right? In context, they typically, on average, increase their total by about 10% in their first year. So let's go back to that average 93-kilo lifter in powerlifting, who's about at the median, who's strong for people, but maybe not strong for a powerlifter. And they do in their very first meet 500-kilo total. Now, if they make a 10% improvement in a year, that means they total 550 in their first meet of the next year. And they're excited. They're like, oh my God, if I can put 50 kilos on my total every year, in 5 years, I'm going to be, going to nationals. And in 10 years, I'll be winning world championships, right? Well, you give me, 10 years, I put 50 kilos on. Shoot, I've moved from, 550 in my first year up to 1,000 kilos at 93, right? Now, we have not yet seen someone total 1,000 kilos at 93. They're in the low 900s, but this bright-eyed person who thought they were just an intermediate, right? They thought, I'm just an average powerlifter. I total 500. But if I keep this pace up, I'm a world champion. Unfortunately, that's not what happens, though. Because to get another 10% increase takes a 10-year career. So that means for them to go from 500 to 550 occurs in a year, but to go from 550 to go to a little, like 600-ish, 605 if you were to do another 10%, that happens around their 9th or 10th year of being in powerlifting on average. Now, that's an example of this logarithmic relationship really not playing out the way you'd anticipate. Yeah. And again, I said earlier, it takes like twice the time to add the same thing. You're like, hold on, that's even worse. Well, you have to remember that people who start powerlifting are already typically well-trained. They have been training in the gym. They're now doing powerlifting for the first time, so they get this kind of quick burst and this specific increase in the squat, the bench, and the deadlift, and then it unfortunately really starts to taper off, and it takes a long time. Now, but if you told me, hey, Eric, if you stay in for a 10-year career, you can go from 550 to 605, I would say that's, if you're committed and you love lifting, well, why not? Awesome. And then it might take you your 20th year to see, a similar improvement. Okay, I can total 655 once I've been lifting for 20 years if I stay healthy. And then you look back and you go, I guess I was an average lifter. It took me 20 years to go from 500 to 650, but that's still awesome. So you actually do get a pretty good idea of where you are in terms of the field based upon your initial, honest try at something. If you trained hard for 2 to 3 years and you put up a 500 kilo total in the gym, you're definitely good. You're an average power lifter. You're stronger than 99% of the world will ever be. But as far as the sport of powerlifting, you're probably going to be constrained to like the 60th or 70th percentile. And you should know that, right? Muscle mass follows a similar trajectory. The changes are just unfortunately much smaller. You can count kilos in 100s, but in terms of like how much muscle mass will you put on, we're talking 10 to 30 pounds on most people over the entire lifetime of training, and it happens in that same process. So I think that is something that's tough to accept, but there's a really important thing to understand here. It's not that you're hitting a limit. It's what is described mathematically as an asymptote. And an asymptote means that there is probably a theoretical limit that you can hit, but there's no like sensor in your body that says, oh, once you hit 90 kilograms of lean mass, I'm turning off muscle protein synthesis. Or once you've loaded a bar with 200 kilos, I'm not going to let you get any stronger. It's just that the anabolic processes and the adaptations that are occurring are more and more and more and more hard to come by. There's an increasingly smaller responses for you to actually be in this positive state of gaining muscle. So we see this when we look at studies on trained individuals, is the magnitude of strength gains and the magnitude of increases in cross-sectional area or muscle thickness are just simply smaller if they're observed at all in the short term. That's just something you have to accept. And the real question we have is, well, why? Why does it get so much harder to continue to make adaptations? But it's something we see across all types of adaptations. Like if you have a 30 VO2 max, you could go on a walking program and you could probably get it up to 35. And maybe then you do a little bit of jogging, get it up to 40. But once you hit like a 50 VO2 max, step count is probably not going to get you higher. And if the same walking program that will get someone sedentary to increase their VO2 max by 10 points, if you give that to a elite endurance athlete who has a VO2 max of 70, and you have them only do that walking program, they will lose 10 points on their VO2 max, right? So adaptation, progressive overload is something you have to understand, is that the more you progress, the more you will need to create a higher stimulus relative to what you're adapted to. Some people think that means I have to do ever increasing volumes, but that's not necessarily the same thing as a higher stimulus. And also we have to accept that even when you provide the higher stimulus sufficient to grow, it's going to be a slower growth rate. So it's a tough thing. And you have a lot of options and ways to try to increase the dose, but there are probably limits to how quickly you can grow, but I don't think there's necessarily a true hard cap limit. It is that it gets so slow that it might effectively be a limit, and there's going to be a point where age-related issues prevent you from getting any bigger. If you start training at, say, 18, and you train for 30 years, and you stay healthy, the data we have would indicate that someone in their late 40s can make almost just as good of gains as someone who's in their late 20s. But someone in their late 40s who's been training since they were 18 is going to be making really, really, really slow progress. But if they kept progressing all the way to that point at the fastest rate they possibly could, they will be as close to functionally at their quote-unquote natural peak as they can be. But it's not like if they hit their peak at 38. They might only gain 1 more pound in the next 10 years, and you might not be able to even visually tell the difference. They might be able to tell the difference. They might say, I'm doing a little bit heavier on these few loads and reps, but there's not a limit in terms of a hard physiological cap there is this ever slowing down process. And the reason why this is important is because if you have to ask, have I hit my limit? I haven't made progress in the last couple of months. The answer is no, because it doesn't abruptly happen. This relationship describes this ever slowing process. And experientially, because of things like motivation, maybe you're in and out of dieting, you get injuries, you get
You're not
ill,
sleeping very
you're
well
not
in that period,
sleeping.
maybe. Very
Yeah,
common. Yeah.
right. You're traveling and don't have access to a good gym or whatever. Unless you can really kind of just sanitize your life to always have training be very consistent, it's going to be this sensation of like progress, plateau, and sometimes realistically, progress, plateau, maybe a slight detraining phase relative to where you were, and then getting back into it. So, for example, I'll take myself, because I come in and out of phases where I'm more focused on bodybuilding or more focused on strength. There have been phases where I haven't been able to do as much, say, direct calf or direct arm training, or direct like lat training when I'm doing pure powerlifting. And there's been phases where I am focusing on my calves, my lats, my arms, just as much as any other muscle group. And I'm actually rapidly gaining muscle there. But I'm first regaining muscle maybe that I had when I was in my last bodybuilding phase. Likewise, while I might include Romanian deadlifts and Smith machine, squats and leg press, and say close grip bench press in my program and dumbbell pressing, I'm not doing powerlifting, heavy squat, bench and deadlift, sumo deadlift, low bar squat, max legal width arched bench press. So like right now, even though I told you my max numbers are right around like a 640 total, I'm also lighter. But like if let's just say I could instantly teleport into my 93 kilo body, and I also just had been training with these same movements, rep ranges, and frequency and variables, I probably would struggle to total 590, right? So, oh my God, I'm 50 kilos down on my best. But within 6 weeks, and I know because I've done this, I would probably be at 620. And then another, 6 weeks after that, I would probably be back at my peak. So you rapidly regain ground that you've tread, which is a really nice thing to know. Muscle memory is real. Through a combination of motor memories as well as physiological mechanisms. So the reality is that as you're moving towards your quote unquote peak natural potential, which I think is a better way to term it, it gets slower and slower and slower and slower. So you're not even close to your peak unless you've had multiple years in the gym, for one, and then probably a couple years of doing everything right and still seeing some progress, but that is getting incrementally slower and slower and slower.
Yeah.
If you just hit an abrupt stop, you're just plateaued, and you need to fix something on the training, nutrition, or recovery side of the equation.
This was a question, very important for me, because I heard also about people, and we are talking about, younger men maybe. So about people that are 26 years old, maybe, that they are talking about, I reached my natural limit. It's absurd if you think about that. Yeah.
If they started training at 16 and they did everything with the maximum amount of effort and precision that you would never expect out of a 16-year-old.
And, yeah, exactly.
And engineered their life to be like purely dedicated to the game, it might be around 95% of it 10 years into training, but it will take them the next 10 years to get the, another 4%. So if they are happy with being at 95% in the best possible case scenario, then sure, you're close to your natural peak. But the reality is that your peak it's two signals that are fighting each other: age-related decline and how much gains you can make before that occurs. So your peak is something around before your first major injury or before you hit 60, And that's another misconception. Like when you look at healthy, active, non-sedentary people who don't have obesity, men, you don't see meaningful declines in testosterone until the 6th decade of life. And even then, you have to ask, is the decline in testosterone in your 60s so much that you can't make progress? And the answer is probably not, because when we look at masters lifters in powerlifting, M3 lifters are still making progress. So that's M3 is over 40 is M1, over 50 is M2, over 60 is M3. We actually don't see, if you take the open powerlifting database and you do men only, and you look at M4s, there's actually a slight decline in strength over their career. So it is not until someone is in their 70s that we actually see them getting weaker in the sport of powerlifting. Now, granted, if they were not powerlifting, they'd be getting weaker even faster. So it's the best thing they could possibly be doing for themselves. And in the very early phase, like let's say you start powerlifting at 70, you will probably get stronger from 70 to 75, and then you'll plateau, and then you might decline as you're approaching the age of 80, of course. But the data would indicate that M1, M2, and M3 men, despite what we would think of as them reaching this point where sarcopenia is setting in and they're, probably having a decline in testosterone, they're getting stronger still. So I think that's just really important to understand, is that if you stay healthy and you stay committed and you're doing things right outside of the gym, there's no reason that you can't continue to work towards your peak even as you approach like the age of 60. And there's really great examples of that in the natural bodybuilding ranks. Probably the best example is Marshall Johnson, who's in his mid 60s, and he is, I'm not going to give false information. He probably hit his peak in his early 50s. Like, he was actually competing at the highest level. He won his weight class in the open division at the Yorton Cup, which is one of the highest prestigious natural bodybuilding titles. I think he was 52 or 54, somewhere in that range.
Yeah.
And he is still placed at that same level in his 60s, but if you look at his physique, he was probably at his peak in his early 50s, which is amazing. But he still looks amazing, and he would beat me on stage in his 60s now. He's just that good. And there are other examples of that in powerlifting. If people stay injury-free, there's a guy named Dave Ricks, who in his 60s is still totaling elite in the 93s in the open division, and actually won world titles in his 50s in the open division. And there's a lot of examples of that. So it's not necessarily the norm, but the point is that if you stay healthy and you stay active, your peak is not going to be constrained by age nearly as early as most people think. And a lot of what we would describe as age-related declines in muscle mass are due to decades of being sedentary. So that's a big misconception.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of this concept. And okay, the one last thing about training that I would like to ask you is a topic very, very, in this moment, it's something that it's in the mouth of everyone. What do you think about those who attribute gains to the muscle edema rather than real hypertrophy? Is this concern valid or exaggerated, in your opinion?
I'd say the most fair thing to say is it's exaggerated, and it's also highly speculative. So, like all things that are often mistaken, there's a grain of truth in the realm of science. We do have data that indicates that there is muscle swelling that's related to the damage or the inflammation process after training. And there's also just acute swelling that occurs at the pump that we all know and love, right? So when you do, let's say, the most common measurement in exercise science, a muscle thickness measurement using ultrasound, the typical practice is to wait 48 to 72 hours after the last measurement, because we have very clear data that resistance training, almost of any type, is going to, especially in beginners, is going to cause a artificially high increase that is not representative of the actual hypertrophy. You can measure someone immediately after training, and you will see like a 10% increase in muscle thickness if you do it right afterwards. And this is what we would describe as like acute muscle swelling, which is interesting, but it's not hypertrophy. So the question is, well, to what degree does this confound our data? Now, where this has been shown most consistently is that the amount of muscle damage and the amount of swelling is higher when you train to failure. It has not been shown consistently that it would be that it happens with more volume, although you would think it would. All the things that increase the dose and the stimulus are going to increase the amount of muscle damage you might experience. But what has also been shown very consistently is what's called the repeated bout effect. Once you repeat a stimulus many, many times, you get substantially less subjective and objective indirect markers of muscle damage. So you get, everyone knows this, you get way less delayed onset muscle soreness now from doing RDLs that you've been doing weekly for 10 years than you did the first time you did RDLs, and you're like, oh my God, I can't move for 2 weeks, right? You might still feel it a little bit, you might be a little stiff, but it is a fraction of what you might have experienced when you first started doing a given movement. And anytime you introduce a new movement, especially if it trains the muscle to long length, and if it has a resistance profile where, especially during the eccentric at a long muscle length, the load is higher, or the tension or the challenge is highest. And that's why the RDL is such a great example. Because if you think about the lever arm from your hip, it's the length of your torso, because you're holding the bar in your hand. So if you think about your hip to your scapula, that's the length of the lever arm. And that load will be highest as experienced by your hip extensors, your hamstrings, your glutes, and your lower back at the point when that barbell is furthest from your body, which is at the point when you're most bent over, which is at the point when your hamstrings, glutes, and lower back are most stretched, and it's at the bottom part of the eccentric. So all the stars align to make you get really sore from something like a heavy RDL, especially close to failure, or for example, like a really heavy, deep dumbbell fly, where the load is heaviest at the end of the eccentric when the pecs are longest. These are exercises which consistently cause soreness, but way less if you've done it for a while. So the question is how much is this influencing things? And you have to listen to the people making claims about this. They make it sound like we know for sure that swelling is a confounding factor that makes the relationship between training variables, often volume, confounded by this phenomenon. So we know that higher volumes just cause more swelling. Well, we don't know that because we haven't actually measured swelling. So this is a guess. It should be better framed as a hypothesis or a question. How do we know that the higher volumes that are associated with more hypertrophy aren't just showing that there's a greater degree of swelling? Now, that's a reasonable question, but it's not a claim you can make because we don't have evidence to prove it, right? And you also have to make sure that you apply, if you're going to be a logical thinker, that same question to anything else. How do we know that training to failure is actually producing more hypertrophy than training to a 4 RIR, or is it just inducing swelling? And if the person is never willing to ask that question, that means they probably have a bias, or at least they're not a very good critical thinker. Because the most clear data we have is that training to failure seems to produce more muscle damage, while it's a little bit less clear, although very intuitive and shown in some cases, that higher volumes also cause more muscle damage and the associated swelling. So the next question is, okay, well, what data do we have that indicates we can mitigate this? Well, if we wait 2 to 3 days, we have pretty clear data that swelling comes down. Okay, but is that long enough? Should I be waiting longer? Well, okay, we have a pretty good study that I was a part of, led by Ruffalo and colleagues, where we took that first initial measurement, and then we waited another 2 to 3 days. So we have a 2 to 3 day versus a 5 to 6 day measurement, and they had almost perfect agreement. But you could ask the question again, well, hold on, how do we know we don't have to wait till longer than 6 days? Well, now we have a problem. Because if we're waiting longer than 6 days of no training, we actually have data that detraining occurs, and muscle will actually atrophy at this point. So are we seeing swelling dissipate, or are we actually seeing atrophy? And that's a very challenging question to answer. And if we decide that 6 days post-training is not long enough to measure hypertrophy, for it to be considered quote-unquote real hypertrophy, now we have to throw out all data that uses ultrasound. Someone wants to do that? Sure. Let's do a thought experiment. We'll forget all data on ultrasound, okay?
Yeah.
Now we have to think about other ways of measuring hypertrophy. Okay, so this would also throw out MRI, cross-sectional area, ultrasound cross-sectional area, or measurements of lean body mass that couldn't account for swelling. Like we have to actually just measure contractile proteins. Well, we do actually have data on what's called muscle fiber hypertrophy, where we do a biopsy, isolate a specific muscle fiber, and look at its growth. And that seems to follow a similar time course and follow a similar pattern. The magnitudes are different. You don't typically see perfect agreement between muscle fiber hypertrophy and, say, cross-sectional area muscle thickness, but the directionality and the time course do look similar in the limited data we have. So, we do see similar amounts of hypertrophy and muscle fiber biopsy hypertrophy when we look at these different time courses. So that would indicate, okay, maybe this is not an issue at the 2 to 3 day mark or longer. But then you ask, well, where is the swelling occurring? This is where you have to really put your thinking cap on. Okay, is swelling happening in the intra myofibular space within the muscle fiber or the inter myofibular space? The answer is probably both, right? So we do have damage that occur. Like if you want to actually look at non-indirect markers of muscle damage, what you have to look at is under a microscope on a biopsy, what's called a Z-line streaming. So the Z-line describes a portion of the sarcomere, right, like we talked about earlier. And if you zoom in really close to a muscle fiber, you can see the alignment of the sarcomeres, right? And Z-line streaming is when you kind of see this blurring and this disruption to the sarcomere, right? You're actually seeing what we think is called the sarcomere popping, where, at these long, high tension, eccentric phase of the contraction, you're getting some damage to the cytoskeleton. And what we experience as DOMs is not that. It's the actual inflammatory process. That's why it's delayed onset muscle soreness. It's not just OMS, right? This is why you don't feel the pain immediately after training. And if you do, oh man, you did some major, you're going to feel even worse tomorrow. The inflammatory repair process, the cascade after you've caused muscle damage from training, and all of these different biological processes are coming in to repair the damage and then build more tissue, you feel that inflammation. So the inflammation comes not only in that initial swelling from just the fluid being retained, but also in the swelling afterwards. So some of the damage and some of the swelling would presumably be within the muscle fiber, and some of it would also be outside of it. And that pressure activates nociceptors, and that's part of what we think DOMS is. Still quite theoretical. We don't fully understand it. But I have a tough time thinking that if individual muscle fiber and whole muscle hypertrophy are following a similar time course, and a 2 to 3 day and a 5 to 6 day ultrasound or have perfect agreement, especially in well-trained lifters in that study that we did, that edema is really this major confounding factor. It would have to be constrained to being predominantly within the muscle fiber, lasting longer than a week, which means it would be confounded by actual detraining if we wanted to look at it long term. And another thing that we have to consider is that this should be a relatively uniform response in everyone. So that means if the hypothesis is the more volume you do, the more swelling you get, and it would also need to be not just hitting a threshold or a plateau, like, okay, you've reached the peak amount of inflammation, but also somehow you keep getting more and more inflamed. That's the only thing that would describe the relationship we see with volume. So my prediction, if people uniformly did more volume and got more swelling, is that we would see less variability in high volume research. But what we actually see in high volume research is diminishing returns. We see this logarithmic relationship where it's unclear in most studies that say 30 sets is better than 15 sets. So if we look at the high volume research, all the 20 plus set studies, the majority of them are leaning towards no significant difference between really high volumes and high volumes. And it is only until you do a meta-analysis or a meta-regression and you look at them and you can tell that these small differences between groups are actually potentially meaningful when you aggregate them across 1,000 participants across, say, 2 dozen, 3 dozen studies. That was done by Pellin and colleagues, right? And that's because volume becomes progressively less beneficial the more you do. Going from, say, 1 set to 4 sets, which is a 300% increase in volume, will make a substantial difference in the amount of muscle mass you gain, right? It'll go from being a change that is sometimes not registered beyond the typical error of an ultrasound measurement or the typical biological variation to being sedentary to a measurable change, like a 2% increase in size that is measurable and we can attribute to the training. But that's still only 4 sets. To get a similar outcome from that, now you have to go from like 4 to 10 sets. So now you're more than doubling your volume to get that similar increase. And then from there, it gets a little more crazy. You got to get into the 18 to 20 set range, and then you got to get to the 30 set range. So adding 1 set means something very different when you're only doing 1 set or when you're already doing 20. And if we think that swelling is a confounding factor here, we shouldn't see that diminishing returns. We should see swelling scaling with volume, and we would see less people having a similar response to lower versus high volume. We wouldn't see non-responders either. Because in almost all these studies, we see some people, for whatever reason, right? Bad sleep, not in a calorie surplus, maybe they're near their peak limit of natural potential, probably not. They're not growing in response to a protocol, whether it's high volume or low volume. But if there was swelling every time you put someone on high volume, we would have this artifact of, oh, well, they are growing. Like, it should at least cause damage. They're not all of a sudden, I don't sleep, so now I don't get muscle damage. Like, that doesn't make any sense. You get worse muscle damage, right? So, I mean, I know me in the depth of preps, when I'm not eating enough, my sleep is a little worse, and my stress levels are higher. I get more delayed onset muscle soreness. I have longer to recover, not shorter. So even if you're not growing,
the same.
Exactly, right? Even if you're not growing, you would be getting a swelling response due to inflammation because you're still breaking down the tissue, even if it doesn't end up growing after the fact. And we're not seeing that. We would see fewer and fewer and fewer non-responders the higher the volume you do. And we do, but it's not a complete absence of them. So I have a tough time squaring at least the hypothesis that swelling continues to increase with volume. I could see a reality where there is kind of like this peak swelling response that occurs with a high dose of training. And it is, like if you do more failure training and you do more long muscle length training and you do a high volume of it, you can get a really, really inflamed sore muscle and you can cause a lot of damage. In a well-trained participant, it's not going to be that high, but it could be high enough to where we may need to wait 3, maybe 4, 5, 6 days. In that study where we compared the 2 to 3 versus the 5 to 6 days, we had people doing training to a 0 to 2 RIR or 1 to 2 RIR on one limb and then to failure in their other limb, on average doing about 15 to 25 sets. And we didn't see a difference between those two marks in well-trained individuals. So in my mind, if the swelling was there would be some change between the 2 to 3 to the 5 to 6 day mark. So I think this is a non-issue. There is probably some degree of swelling that is confounding all training research. I don't think it is unique to volume. And I also don't think that it is a linear dose response between, or even a logarithmic diminishing dose response between swelling and volume. But it is some amount that we can't quite know, but that doesn't seem to be actually confounding the relationship. And it doesn't make sense to me that it would be describing the entirety of the reason why higher volumes produce more hypertrophy.
I agree totally with you about everything because I had the same idea. It's something that I think that is an idea. This one about it's not hypertrophy, it's edema. As also I noticed the Professor De Souza that He is talking a lot about that on Instagram.
Yeah,
it's
I really
something
appreciate
that
him talking to it.
Yeah, it comes from people that they never experienced any kind of research about that, measurements, how to conduct research, and all this stuff. So they don't have I think, the instruments to think about this is edema, not hypertrophy. This is the thing.
Also, Riccardo, let me ask you a question. You and I both compete in physique sport, right? If the more volume I did, the more cross-sectional area or muscle thickness I got, and it took longer than 6 or 7 days to dissipate to the point where I'd actually be losing muscle to see it, do I care whether it's actual muscle fiber hypertrophy or just muscle swelling? If it makes me look bigger and I retain that for a full week, even if I don't train, I don't.
Yeah.
Because it might as well be hypertrophy for the purposes of physique sport.
But in fact, this is another point against this theory, edema theory, because if we can hypothesize that there is this edema that can last 3-4 days, okay, and so because usually you will train in a range of 4 days, for example, you will train again, so we don't still see the meaning of all this edema stuff. in any case.
One final point. Some studies that are a little bit longer, they sometimes have a midpoint measurement. So let's say you have a 12-week study on high volume, and you have a measurement at week 1, 6, and 12.
Yep.
You typically see greater gains from week 1 to week 6, but you don't see no gains from week 6 to week 12. If it was just edema that was being maintained, you would see an increase from week 1 to week 6, and then the same mean value from week 6 to week 12. Because there was, you're not getting just this accumulated edema. Like, it's at a certain point, are you walking around and you're a water balloon? Like, help me understand this, The claim is not clear. Like, there is a limit to how much swelling you can have, and we live in the real world. Like, if you look at the most recent surveys on modern bodybuilders, they're doing 15 to 25 direct sets per muscle group, mostly near failure, and they are not like needing to be pushed around in like a jacuzzi with wheels because they're just this huge Jabba the Hutt water balloon. They are trying to gain more muscle than they're unable to. So if the edema is occurring in a 12-week study, you'd think it would be occurring entirely within the first couple sessions and then just being maintained. And if there's no growth, there'd be no change from the midpoint to the post-test. But that's not what we observe. We still observe some gains from mid to post, even if they're less than pre to mid, which we would expect anytime you're providing a novel stimulus or a new training program or harder training than people typically do, which is what happens when they do high volume studies. You see rapid growth and then it starts to slow down, just like that logarithmic thing we talked about for your natural peak. So there is a way of thinking that is very important to learn from this, not just the question of is high volume just inducing edema or is it actually inducing muscle growth. We have to try to prove our hypotheses wrong, not try to find evidence that allows us to hold on to our biases. So if you want to think scientifically, if you want to be right more often than you are wrong, when you have a hypothesis, when you have a hunch or you have a belief about the world, the next step is to go out and look at the verifiable data, the valid data, I should say, and see what can falsify your beliefs.
Exactly.
If my beliefs are true, what would I need to see to maintain that belief? What could disprove it? So if I think high volume studies produce edema, okay, cool, and that's all that's happening and not muscle growth, well, I need to find a study that has a pre, mid, and a post. And if there's no growth in most of these studies from mid to post, then maybe I'm right. But if I find even one study that is well done and conducted and has a decent sample size, where there is growth from mid to post, then the belief I have has been falsified by that. That's the basic premise of why we do empirical research and why we have null hypothesis testing. So you have to ask yourself, if I believe the world works in this way, what could I observe in the world that would disconfirm that? Because we can't know for sure what's going on. That's not the way it works. We don't get to have the magic God, microscope or knowledge omnipotence. We just have to look for evidence. So if you can find evidence that disproves your belief, you have to be ready to reject it. But if you want to sit in your comfortable little space and believe whatever the hell your biases tell you, then go out and look for evidence that confirms it and ignore everything else. And that's what's typically happening in these conversations, because the person in question is not interested in the question of what grows the most muscle and why. They're interested in, I already believe that a low volume, high intensity approach is best, and the people I trust and I like and I feel comfortable with have told me that, and I want to believe that, so I am going to look for any way to maintain that belief because it makes me feel better from an existential perspective and for my ego.
Yeah. It's very common. Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. And now, if you have a little bit of time, we can dive into the nutritional part of this podcast, because also I know that you are part of the Sports Nutrition Association, correct?
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I'm on their board, and I am I'm an accredited sports nutritionist through their organization. Because I created part of the curriculum and I've reviewed it. Yeah.
But you are, because this is another thing that I think that not a lot of people know. I mean, talking about general people that maybe know you, they maybe don't know that you are also a nutritionist. You are a sport nutritionist. Or
It
maybe
totally
I'm
depends.
wrong. Correct me.
No, it totally depends upon where they have become familiar with my content. Some people think I'm nutrition focused because that's what they're interested in. Some people think I am exercise science focused because that's what they're interested in. Some people think I'm a powerlifting coach, a bodybuilding coach, a bodybuilder. It just depends because the fitness industry is so siloed. Some people know me really well from my work with flexible dieting. Other people know me really well as a powerlifting coach. Other people know me from talking about hypertrophy training. Other people from strength training. So I did my second master's, my master's of philosophy, specifically on manipulating macronutrients and protein intake while dieting. So I have a master's degree in essentially sports nutrition. And I have been heavily nutrition focused and doing nutrition in my duties as a bodybuilding and powerlifting coach for the entirety of my career. I would describe myself as a physique and strength sport coach and scientist. So I must be equally skilled in both, but highly specialized. If you were to ask me about how do I train for a marathon, even though I have a sport and exercise degree on that wall, no idea. If you were to ask me what is the best diet to reduce my risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, I would not be able to tell you, even though I've taken many a nutrition course and I am an accredited sports nutritionist. I mean, I would be able to tell you the basics because I've taken the undergraduate coursework and the graduate coursework, but in terms of my expertise, it is strength and physique sport, which requires a lot of nutrition and training knowledge.
Yeah. No, thank you for this for this acknowledgement about that, because it was something that I was interested in, for example, but it was like I was thinking. And so, a question about nutrition and gym. Is there an ideal caloric surplus range for hypertrophy?
There is, but it's almost impossible to know what it is for you. The best way to view energy intake for hypertrophy is that your training induces the stimulus, and then your nutrition is permissive to to the hypertrophy you can attain. So if you look at studies on rank beginners, great study by Rosnick and colleagues, where they had university males for 8 weeks doing a hypertrophy program, and they either followed their habitual diet or they got a 2,000 calorie weight gainer. Didn't matter if it was pure carbs or a mixture of carbs and protein. The groups that got the 2,000 calorie weight gainer, they put on about 3.5 kilos of lean mass over those 8 weeks, and that was all they gained. Their body mass and their lean mass gains were the same. And the group that just followed their habitual diet gained about half as much, and they lost a little bit of body fat. So when you take an untrained lifter and their first 8 weeks of progressive, serious, hard training, if you don't feed them enough, then you are not permitting their training to do its full job as far as hypertrophy, and they're going to have to find other ways to make up that to square the energy balance books, right? So in that study, they gained about 1.5 kilos. The group that was not eating enough to grow maximally, they gained about 1.5 kilos of lean mass, and they lost just short of 1 kilo of fat mass. So their net scale weight went up, about 1 pound over 8 weeks. And that's not ideal, right? We know that if you you want to make the maximum amount of gains as a novice, you need to eat to fuel that. And that's because you have such a high growth potential. Now, that's very different from someone who is like myself. If I'm only going to grow 1 kilo, I think realistically, I probably put on 2 kilos of muscle mass since 2023, when I exclusively focused on bodybuilding, stopped training for powerlifting, and did everything perfectly in my power. Not great gains for a novice. Like I said, these guys are gaining that amount in 8 weeks and more. But for someone who's been lifting for, since 2004, to hit your 20th year of training and to put on, a couple kilos of lean mass, that's fantastic. But think about that as far as how much of a surplus did I need to be in, right? 4 kilos in 1.5 years. So that's, let's say, 36 months. Yeah. So that's like 100 grams a month or something like that. Something not even maybe more than that, 200 grams a month. So I don't need to be in that large of a surplus. So an advanced lifter should make sure that their nutrition is still permissive to their gains, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a massive surplus. It can be probably what feels like maintenance, and you're just slowly seeing your body weight go up maybe 1% a month, for example, and knowing that you're still going to be predominantly gaining body fat because you can only gain muscle mass so quickly. What you probably want to avoid is if you're reasonably lean, being in a deficit, because both of those things make it harder to grow muscle mass. Like I mentioned, it's an ATP intensive process to do protein synthesis, and you need all the essential amino acids and enough energy, or you'll slow down. Like you saw in Rosnick, gaining half as much lean mass in those people who were not eating in a surplus. They were actually in a slight deficit, losing body fat and gaining muscle, which is awesome. And you can recomposition, but you can't do it when you're already really, really, really lean, because the hormonal environment, your ability to sleep, all the things that we talked about earlier, like the way you feel at the end of contest prep, it's completely not conducive to gaining muscle. You're trying to hold on to muscle, right? So if you're like 7% body fat or 15% body fat as a man or a woman, respectively, you're not a good candidate for recomposition. You don't have nearly enough fat tissue for your body to want to pull from that to make up for an energy deficit. But if you're at 17% body fat or, 30% body fat as a female, in both of those cases, you could probably be at maintenance or in a slight deficit and still gain a decent amount of muscle. Would it be slightly worse than if you were in a slight surplus? Maybe. But if you're an advanced lifter, you can only grow so quickly. So the question of how big should your surplus be should be bootstrapped to how quickly can I grow muscle mass? And then you want to make the surplus a sufficient size to allow that. And after the kind of first couple years of training where you're making your novice gains and your early stage intermediate gains, it should be a very small surplus and closer to gaining like 1% of body weight per month at most, especially as an advanced lifter. And that's all that's needed, because faster than that will just result in a faster accrual of fat mass.
Yeah. It's a question that a lot of time people tends to make about the famous lean book or dirty book, stuff like that. But yes, I think that it's something that we talk a lot during this podcast about the difference between also your level at the gym. I mean, if you are a novice, intermediate, or advanced, this can probably make a difference. Also, obviously, your body fat at the point that you want to start the surplus. Really, really nice advices, really. And dive into more about the macros. What about protein? I mean, how much protein you really need to build muscle?
You don't need much to build muscle. The question is, where do you stop benefiting from higher intakes? So the most recent meta-analysis that was done on this is by Nunes and colleagues. And they had close to 2,400 participants across, I think, mid-60s number of studies on resistance training and looking at changes in lean body mass. And you see positive values even when they broke it down into quartiles of protein intakes in the 1.2 to 1.59 grams per kilogram range. So that's all you need to make muscle mass gains. That is a positive standardized mean difference, a positive effect size, an increase in lean body mass in those studies. So that is enough to permit muscle mass gains. However, when you compare that quartile to greater than 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein, you see a slightly higher effect size. The difference between the two is trivial, but the overall effect size is like 1.7 versus like 0.3. So you see a slightly better benefit of eating at a higher protein intake. Now, I don't like to chop and change a regression. So what that means is, we're looking at all 67 studies, and then we're looking at like only the ones that had high protein, moderate, or lower protein intake. When you're below 1.2 grams per kilogram of protein in that kind of chop and change quartiles, you actually don't see a positive outcome for muscle growth. So yeah, if you're eating really low protein, it's probably not enough to actually supply the necessary goods to make clear, unambiguous gains in lean mass, unfortunately. So getting up to 1.2 grams per kilogram is like a good decision for someone who is a casual lifter who struggles to get enough protein, and that will be enough. That's all you need on average.
Yeah.
But if you want to optimize the process, Then the question is, all right, well, when I look at this whole regression, when do I start to see a plateau in that
Mm-hmm.
relationship? When do I stop seeing higher amounts of lean body mass gained with higher amounts of protein? And that plateau is happening somewhere around what looks to be between 2 to 3 grams per kilogram. And the more important thing is that the difference between 2 and 1.6 is so negligible you would never notice. So if I'm talking to the general person who's in a calorie surplus trying to put on muscle, 1.6 or greater. If I'm talking to obsessive bodybuilders trying to do everything perfectly, maybe around 2 grams per kg is a decent goal on a day-to-day basis. That will definitely maximize any kind of potential outcome, and maybe over 5 years you'd notice a difference if you could look at your twin in an alternate universe who is always at 1.6. Then your question about body fat, that's an interesting one, because
Mm-hmm.
just like an energy balance interacts with body fat, an energy balance and body fat interacts with protein intake. We did a recent meta-regression, myself, Dr. Ruffalo, and Dr. Trexler, and we found that the point at which you are no longer losing lean mass and actually potentially gaining lean mass is a higher protein intake when you're in a deficit. So a deficit means that it's harder to gain muscle mass, which we've described, which we've talked about. And if you're at 1.2 grams per kilogram in a deficit versus in a surplus, unfortunately, on average, that is not going to result in a gain in muscle mass when you're at a deficit, unless you're relatively high in body fat. If you're relatively high in body fat, it's kind of a similar relationship. We broke our meta regression down on the 750 participants into low, moderate, and high body fat percentages, and we exclusively looked at people who were not in the category of roughly what is obesity. So we're looking at essentially non-overweight individuals for the most part, or at least non-obese. And among those individuals, when you have lean, normal, or not overweight but not lean category, that first category or that third category, the people who are relatively high in body fat but not unhealthily so, or not, that's not fair to say, that are not really high in body fat,
Mm-hmm.
it probably doesn't matter. You could have a similar protein intake deficit or surplus. But when you look at people in the kind of middle range or quote unquote normal body fat or lean body fat, which is like under 12% for men or under 20% for women, now you actually have to be at a higher protein intake closer to 2 grams per kilogram just to maintain muscle mass. And
Mm-hmm.
we actually see outcomes favoring slight, very slight gains in lean body mass when you're over that amount. So a decent rule of thumb for someone who is dieting and lean is you probably want to be around or above 2 grams per kilogram, probably in the range of 2 to 3 grams per kilogram per day of protein if you look at total body mass, or higher than 2.5 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass if you want to calculate it that way in a deficit if you're also not overweight. So that's an important thing to remember, is that you will potentially require a higher protein amount not to lose lean mass in a deficit, versus what does it take to gain the minimum amount versus the ideal amount in a surplus.
And just one thing that we tends to take for granted, but I think that maybe for maybe the general public is not that grand. It's the we are talking about all the proteins in your diet, not only
Absolutely.
the specific source. All.
Correct. And that doesn't seem to make a difference when you're up in these gram targets. We actually have
Mm-hmm.
2 longitudinal studies now comparing vegans to omnivores. One is by Montine, and one is by Havea Lorraine. And they both looked at muscle fiber hypertrophy, cross-sectional area, and changes in lean body mass, and changes in strength. And they found if you're following a vegan diet or an omnivorous diet, in one they had about 1.6 grams per kilogram protein per day, the other one about 2.1 to 2.3. So both high protein diets, and very comparable gains over 8 and 12 weeks in all of those metrics, indicating that once you're at a sufficiently high protein intake, the source of protein and the supposed quote unquote quality matters a whole lot less. So the good news is you can get that from mixed sources. A well-constructed vegan diet where you're getting protein from multiple plant sources, and they've got really good options now, meat
Yeah.
replacements as well as supplements. Your pea protein, rice, wheat, all those isolates, especially blends. In the context of a whole diet with multiple protein boluses and meals per day, it's not something you need to worry about if you're at 1.6 grams per kilogram or higher, even as a vegan, at least in the range of like, say, 12 weeks.
And talking always about macronutrients, the other question is about the other two. I mean, fats and carbohydrates. If the goal is hypertrophy, also performance, but specifically hypertrophy, which one is better to prioritize, and are there clear contexts where one should be emphasized over the other?
The best way to do this is to set minimum intakes for each of these, to make sure that you're not low enough to where it could compromise what you're trying to do. For performance, it's a little different. Then it becomes, what's the specific performance, what's the energy expenditure, and what energy systems do you rely on? But for people interested in lifting weights and bodybuilding, you have really wide latitude with where you get your energy from, and you just want to make sure you're not too low in fat or too low in carbohydrates. And too low are slightly different, values for each one of those. If you look at the data where the proportion of fat from calories independent of the total calorie intake causes issues, you need to think about, all right, at really, 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 really low intakes, we're talking like under 10 grams a day, you can have issues with developing gallbladder stones, like an acute medical issue that occurs over the order of weeks. So that's too low. From there, you can go, okay, well, how much do I need to get in all my essential fatty acid to absorb fat-soluble vitamins? And that's not that much, actually. We're talking like 20 to 30 grams, right? But then if we're going, okay, well, if we look at meta-analyses on estrogen in women and testosterone in men, we've got some decent data if we extrapolate it to absolute gram amounts that 40 to 60 grams per day is what you'd need to have normal levels and not slight declines in these potentially anabolic hormones for men and women, respectively. So a decent rule of thumb is to have 40 to 60 grams of fat per day as your minimum, and probably scaling that to your body size to some degree. So if you're, a male who is 90 kilograms or higher, maybe 60. If you're male or female and you're, say 50, like kilograms, maybe 40, and 50 somewhere between. But on a day-to-day basis, there could be fluctuation. So a minimum intake of 40 to 60 grams of fat is what the data would suggest is sufficient. And then as far as carbohydrate, a minimal intake is, well, what do you need to perform? And when we look at data on strength athletes versus bodybuilders and, say, muscular endurance performance and other athletes, I would say a minimum in the off-season when you're not in a calorie budget is around like 2 grams per kilogram per day as your minimum intake. So let's say you had a 75 kilogram person and you wanted to set up their diet to optimize hypertrophy. Okay, 2 grams per kilogram of protein minimum, that's 150. And that's more than enough, right? You could say 1.6 if you wanted, and that would be closer to like 120 or something like that. Then, okay, minimum amount of carbohydrates per day, 150 grams. Minimum amount of fat per day, 50 grams. So that's quite easy, 150, 150, 50 minimum. Then you go, well, Eric, that's only like 1,600, 1,700 calories. What do I do with the rest of my calories? Whatever the hell you want, because you've met your minimum requirements. Remember that nutrition isn't what's stimulating growth. Nutrition is what's permitting growth. So if you have a sufficient amount of carbohydrates so you can train effectively and you have steady energy levels, you have a sufficient amount of fat to meet all your nutrient needs, prevent acute medical issues with gallstones, and also to make sure that your testosterone and your estrogen levels, depending upon your sex, are in good ranges to support muscle growth. After that, if you want to follow a more higher fat or higher carbohydrate approach, let that be your personal preference and based upon what you observe. So the average person who is lifting weights 4 to 6 times a week, and they should be if they're trying to maximize hypertrophy and they're eating 2 grams per kilogram of protein per day, who is even sedentary, will probably need to be consuming 2,200 calories up to 3,200 calories, because there's huge individual variation in what people need to meet their energy needs. So if you're someone with a very sedentary lifestyle who just genetically doesn't burn a lot of calories, that means you've got 500 to 600 calories to play with after you hit your minimums. And if you're on the other end of the spectrum and you burn a lot of calories, you've got 1,500 to 1,600 calories to play with. So you can, dealer's choice, have more carbohydrate, fat, or even protein dominant foods. There's nothing wrong with going very high in protein. It just, makes your farts stink.
Yep. And since we mentioned the maybe a calorie deficit, another thing that I would like to ask you is, how does being in a caloric deficit affect overall health and performance? Because are there key differences between men and women in this regard, especially considering risk like low energy availability? I'm asking you because a lot of people tends to maybe maintain a calorie deficit, maybe huge calorie deficit for a long term, for a long period, and since maybe they reached some metabolic adaptation, so they are very low, but at the same time they don't see them so okay, so good, thinking about their goals in body fat, stuff like that. We know that at that point, if you are too low, you need to increase your calories. But since they tends to they are scared about gaining fat, but at the same time, in my opinion, the problem is that they are not able to understand what their body is experiencing in that moment, about all the hormonal stuff, about low energy availability. So for this reason, I want to make you this question.
Yeah, so low energy availability is when you're consuming fewer calories than your body needs relative to lean mass, and including the training and total daily activity that you get from activity, so your physical activity. So you can be in a calorie deficit that does not produce low energy availability, or you can be in a very large calorie deficit that does produce a state of low energy availability. Typically, when you're in a calories deficit of, say, 1 to 500-ish on average, if you're not very low in body fat and you're not experiencing metabolic adaptation because of prior dieting, and if you're decently active and you have a high energy flux, meaning you're active and you're doing things throughout the day, you're not sedentary, then you might be able to sustain a 500, 600 calorie deficit and still have a sufficient amount of energy. But if you are trying to diet fast and have an energy deficit that's greater than 500 or 600, you're more than likely to be at a point where your body is not getting what it needs to keep all of the physiological function optimized while losing fat and fueling your performance. And low energy availability affects men and women, and the question of whether it affects women worse is really depending upon what do you value and what aspects of your health are you emphasizing. So if you are a woman who is trying to lose weight, but you're also interested in, let's say, having a child, you would want to make sure that you weren't too low in energy availability, because one of the first things that occurs is a disruption to reproductive hormones. So you'll see luteinizing hormone, one of the first early warning systems, if you will, of hormonal disruption and disruption to your menstrual cycle. Luteinizing hormone has basically a diurnal pulsatil pattern. So LH, luteinizing hormone pulsatility, starts to get disrupted very quickly when you're on a very low energy diet. And within weeks to a month even, you might experience oligomenorrhea, so a disruption to the consistency of your menstrual cycle, and potentially even amenorrhea, which is the cessation of your menstrual cycle, and you won't be able to have a child. The good news is that will reverse, but you have to get back into a state of sufficient energy availability to do that, and it might take time. There are some case studies on physique competitors who are female who were on a very low energy availability diet for the entirety of a contest prep, and it took like almost a full year or longer for that to come back, especially if they were being overly restrictive even in the post-competition period, even intermittently, while gaining weight. So that might not be a problem for men, because men will still produce a sufficient amount of sperm to be fertile, although maybe a little bit compromised, but men can still impregnate a woman when they are in a state of low energy availability. But everything else they're still going to experience actually in a very similar way. So they will see a drop in testosterone. They will see immune system be compromised, just like a woman. You will see disrupted sleep in some cases, mood, performance, losses of lean body mass because muscle protein synthesis is impacted negatively by low energy availability. And that's the same between men and women. Women, you could argue this is more of an issue because part of the process of amenorrhea is not producing as much estrogen, and that could have long-term consequences on bone health if it persists for too long. And you won't see that in men, although men do lose more lean body mass when dieting on average. That might be because some of the reason we carry more lean body mass is because of testosterone. And if testosterone drops a lot, then we're kind of becoming a little more on like the baseline level of muscle mass that a woman would have. So men are typically at greater risk of losing lean mass during dieting, especially when they get lean. The other difference between men and women is that men have lower levels of essential fat. So if you look at a shredded woman and a shredded man, they might both have like cross striations in their quads. The woman is probably going to be closer to 12 to 15% body fat. The man will be closer to 5 to 7%. So they'll look the same, but there will be more internal fat in the woman that's there specifically to support the growth of a child and support pregnancy and things like that. So, yeah, those are the different considerations you need to think about. So women are typically going to experience more issues related to fertility that may matter. But men and women seem to experience the same symptoms outside of that, but their own version of it because they have different reproductive hormones and biology do at the same points. There is some speculation that men have a lower threshold for when they experience full-blown REDS, which is relative energy deficiency in sport, which describes all of the negative effects of debilitative or non-functional low energy availability. Anyone wants to read the IOC 2023 British Journal of Sports Medicine position stand on low energy availability in sport, it's a good one to read. It's open access. It gives all the details on this. But essentially, you can be at a slight degree of low energy availability, experience some of these consequences, but have it not severely negatively impact your health or performance. And that is what a lot of weight class restricted athletes do, or high energy output athletes like marathon runners have to do, or what you might experience in the first 2/3 of contest prep. But if you have to get really, really, really lean and you're pushing below your lower intervention point of body fat, and you're pushing past the point of experiencing metabolic adaptation, you're almost certainly going to have to get to a status of low energy availability for some time. And there's no avoiding that. It's just a question of how much can you mitigate the consequences. And the main thing that you can do is diet for longer or take intermittent breaks. But this is why physique competitors don't stay and can't stay shredded all year round and still be effective and grow muscle in the off season and be happy and well balanced and healthy. Yeah. So ultimately, for a deficit, you probably want to be losing closer to 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per week. That should avoid severe low energy availability. And the leaner you get, the closer you want to be to, say, 0.5% is a decent rule of thumb. So let's say you have 10 kilos to lose to get on stage. That's starting reasonably lean for most people. If you're only competing at 50 kilos, that's not that lean. But if you're competing at, like, say, 80 kilos for me, 10 kilos over is, like you look good on the beach at 10 kilos over stage weight, right?
Yeah, totally.
To lose the first 5 kilos, you could be between, say, 0.7 to 1% of body weight losses per week. But when you lose the last 5 kilos, you probably want to be closer to like 0.3 to 0.5% for an average of 0.5% of body weight per week. So that conflicts with like the typical bodybuilding 12 to 16 week diet that people try to use to get in shape. 16 weeks maybe if you're starting lean, but for most people we're talking 20 to 30 weeks would be appropriate if they're, say, 10 kilos over, because, you know, it's going to take you 20 weeks, you know, to lose that. And that's assuming everything goes perfect, that you don't take a diet break, that you're not traveling, you know, you don't hit a plateau, etc. And the reality is that when you have 2 kilos left of subcutaneous body fat you need to lose versus 10, losing 1 kilo is 50%, not 10% of the fat left on your body. And you try to lose fat quickly. When you have very little amount of fat, you tend to lose muscle mass. And that's been shown in a lot of research, and it's anecdotal. I mean, if you talk to any natural bodybuilders, they know that they're at more risk of getting that loss of fullness and the appearance of muscle mass when they're toward the end stage of prep. But we've got data, like if you look at quartiles of body fat percentage in men losing weight, if you break them up into like quartiles of highest to lowest body fat percentage, there's a great study by Hemsfield and colleagues that was done in the mid 2000s. You see lean body mass losses much more consistently in that lowest quartile, the leanest men. So you have to be very careful about that.
Yeah. Thank you for all this information. I hope that it will help our audience in their choices, especially. And one last question, but it's not about training, it's not about nutrition, it's about you specifically. And it's what gives you the most fulfillment today? Training, science communication, or mentoring?
They're so different. And that's like, it's like asking someone if they like chocolate cake or pizza better, you know? Right? When you eat pizza, you don't want chocolate cake. But it doesn't mean you like pizza better than chocolate cake. So I didn't answer your question, but I will say that I need each one of those in my life. Mentoring individuals and seeing them progress through their journey, it gives you a sense of such a high quality sense of service and collaboration, and you form lifelong bonds with people, and you get to see them, carry the torch forward in an area that you really care about. So, for example, getting to be your distance supervisor while you're here at AUT is a joy. I love it. Mentoring students all the way through a PhD. I've yet to have a PhD student graduate, and I haven't read their acknowledgments or had a moment with them where I'm not brought to tears, because I know how much they had to work through to get there. But at the same time, I can only have so many PhD students at any given time. And I know the impact I'm making, while it's so valuable for that person and all the lives they touch, being able to get on a podcast that has a broad reach, or do a reel on my Instagram that has a broad reach, and if I can effectively communicate something that really helps people understand, move forward, and overcome personal plateaus, and help their own learning, and I'm reaching thousands of people, I know that is me making a larger impact on the community. So those are two different ways of impacting the community, using my platform, which I'm very privileged to have and I've built, and also impacting people on a one-to-one basis. So it's kind of like a quantity and quality, and you need both. And then my own personal training, it's who I am. And it is my personal athletic pursuits, my desire to compete in bodybuilding. I'm probably going to be that M4 competitor, still on stage and still figuring out which lifts I can do, even if it's bench only. In my 70s, still competing, because it is the lifeblood. It is who I am. It's what I do. And I'll lift as long as I possibly can. And I'm going to try to fulfill my potential. It's like making my life a video game, and I love it. It's like, how do I max out my stats? I know I'm on like the hardest difficulty on the last level. And, I'm in my early 40s. I'm now competing against pros. And I feel like I've already won. Like, I've replayed the game 3 times. And now I'm trying to get every single little award. And there's only a few people who ever get to do it. So I'm already kind of running my victory lap. I got my WNBF pro card, and now I'm competing in my first proper pro debut after having a pro off season, not just my first pro show that I did 7 weeks after I turned pro. And I have this now, like, once you get your pro card, the goal jumps like all the way to the stratosphere. I was fighting for a pro card. I won shows, but not the overall. I won classes, but not the overall. I won shows that weren't big enough to award a pro card. I placed second to many overall winners, and then finally, 2023, after competing with the INBF, WNBF since 2009, I turned pro. And then I placed 7th at Worlds, in the pro class. So now, like, just getting to 6th, 5th, 4th, and knowing that it's going to be a different group of athletes on stage every time, and placings don't tell you everything. It's so incredibly hard. I don't know that I'll ever be able to place like top 3 in a pro show, but having that goal that is now even harder than getting my pro card is something that's going to keep motivating me. So they're all very, very different, and I love them all.
Yeah, those are all parts of you. It's clear, that one. No, it's amazing, really. All right, before we wrap it up, where can people follow what you're doing? And feel free to give a quick shout out of MESS, of Team 3D MJ, that I know that you started probably also a vlog about your preparation on that. And also your books.
Well, thank you. So yeah, first, since you're already on YouTube watching this, just head over to the 3DMJ YouTube channel. I'm sure we'll have a link to that. That's youtube.com/team 3DMJ. We've got great content from all the coaches, specialists, and also my own vlog, as I'm now, I think, 9 or 10 weeks into my contest prep. And the first episode that is at the 6 weeks of dieting mark came out just a couple days ago. And if someone's interested in coaching, then definitely check out 3dmusclejourney.com, because we coach a ton of natural athletes, competitive, non-competitive, strength athlete, or natural bodybuilder. And then if you're interested in more of the science nerdy stuff, definitely check out massresearchreview.com. I put out every month an issue and have done so since 2017. So we've got 1,000+ reviews and pieces of content with myself, Dr. Eric Trexler, Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple, and Dr. Mike Zerdos. And we originally had Greg Knuckles as part of the crew until I think the first 3 or 4 years, 5 years actually, of Mass. And that is us going over the most recent and most relevant, practically applied stuff in nutrition, fitness, training, health, strength, you name it. It's all the most relevant research and how to interpret it and use it in practice. And similarly, I have my books, The Muscle and Strength Pyramids, which I'm working on the 3rd edition, which are basically the Bible of nutrition and training for strength and hypertrophy, with appendices on how to peak for powerlifting and bodybuilding, everything in that realm with the latest research. So yeah, you can check those out at muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. And I have to give a shout out to my original co-authors who helped me put that together, Andrea Valdez and also Andy Morgan.
Very
and
good,
finally,
very good.
where you want to keep up with all the stuff I'm doing in one place, that's just follow me at Instagram at Helms3DMJ.
Yeah, it's true. Totally. I already follow you.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Riccardo.
Okay. Thanks again for hanging out with us, and catch you in the next episode. And until then, keep training smart.